delighted to have Francis back with us again. He was here with us in March, and welcome back.
Okay, thank you very much, comrades and friends. First of all, nice to be here on the night of a celebration of one of the few men ever to enter Parliament with honest intentions. I always think that's worth saying. I'd like to formally launch Saothar 41 and welcome contributors, Stevie and Chloe Alexander there, come down from Aberdeen, making the point that the journal has quite a strong Scottish content, and that's notwithstanding the fact that the central figure is a man from Edinburgh, James Connolly. The Labour History Society was formed in 1973, and probably what distinguishes the Irish Society from most societies is we have regularly over those years had a situation where not one single academic has been involved in the committee. It's largely a labour movement organisation. That's not to say we haven't met scholarly standards and that the journal isn't respected by the academic world. Even in this edition, when you look at the notes and contributors, the thing I always take great pleasure from is the amount of people that are either first-time historians or worker historians, but producing to a very high level. So that's one of the things we're particularly proud of. The second thing you'll notice is the journal and the society is funded by individual members, and you're very welcome yourselves to join. If you give us 15 quid, you become a member and you get the journal free, take it away with you, and there's a hardback version if you want to throw an extra £5 in. But it's primarily the funding of the trade union movement, both directly, by affiliation, by advertising, and by delegating people to come to our conferences. So we are very much a product of the movement. Saothar 41 has two editorials, the first of which addresses some of the issues I'm going to return to in a second in relation to 1916. The other one addresses the fact that 40 issues of the journal had occurred. And really what's remarkable about it is that when the journal first appeared, there was nobody on the island that was professionally involved at third level in teaching labour history. So we were an academic or scholarly society in the absence of a subject. It's now got to the stage where there are scores, literally, particularly of young scholars, who are researching and writing in labour history. So the journal itself, in that way, has been a bit of a triumph. It doesn't normally look like Saothar 41, and I think the Society Committee and SIPTU, who sponsored it, deserve great credit for allowing us to have, what is quite a lavish, but obviously a commemorative issue. The front cover, when you look at it, and I can't lift it up now, otherwise we'll lose the plough and stars, but it has a number of images which are taken from a tapestry that currently drapes Liberty Hall. Now, Liberty Hall is a 16-storey building, but the mural drapes the whole building on three sides. And what the tapestry is, I should say, is an extension of a tapestry that was first done for the 1913 lockout, which also drapes Liberty Hall. So it's one of the great examples of public art in Ireland, both in 2013 and this year. And what's also good about it, it's designed, by the way, primarily by Robert Ballard, famous artist who's one of the iconic Che Guevara Connolly images, which I'm sure you've seen, is the fact that the tapestry was done by thousands of hands, women's groups, long-term prisoners, youth groups, school children, trade unionists. So it's a product of collective activity to create a piece of art, which I think is rather wonderful. And one of the things that's happened in 1916 celebrations, or commemorations, has been the retrieval from history of those that previously had been obscure, women being a very good example. So you'll see that one of the panels in the tapestry, which is featured on the front cover, features a number of women like Rosie Hackett, like Mairead Skinner, that Kirsty Lusk wrote about in the journal, and so on. The second thing that's happened, for those of you here who are by definition of being here interested in Irish history, in the last number of years, the National Archives of Ireland have released what were known as witness statements. Now, those witness statements were gathered by the Department of Defence. Irish Army officers were trained in what we would now call oral history. And anybody who participated in the Rising or the War of Independence was invited, if they wished, to make a witness statement. By and large, these statements were simply recorded and transcribed, but they remained under lock and key. I think the deal was that until the last one died, they couldn't be released to the public. Anyway, they were released. What that means, therefore, is that we have a testimony now from hundreds and hundreds of people, including our friend, the singer's, Eddie Eddie Reader's uncle, two uncles in fact, rank and file people from the whole of Ireland. Now, in many cases, oddly enough, some of the people that made witness statements by the time they made the statements, recorded in the late 40s, early 50s, were no longer resident in Ireland. In some cases, they came back to make the statements. Now, the problem with the witness statements is that you can really say what you like. So in a witness statement, I can say, this is what I did, or this is what Jimmy did, or this is what Billy did. There was no cross-referencing or checking. Now, that's not to say that people were untruthful. It's more than myself, if we were recalling events. Well, I always like to put a wee bit of butter on the bread anyway, you know what I'm saying? So there might have been exaggeration or just simple forgetfulness. However, in the 1920s, the Free State government introduced a thing called the military service pensions. And that meant you could claim a pension based on your activity in either the Rising or the War of Independence. But on this occasion, apart from the fact you had to fill in forms and they were quite elaborate, it had to be cross-referenced by somebody who was in command or at that point in a position of authority. So an army officer, a guard, a civil servant, whatever. So there was a lot of cross-referencing. Now those pension applications also remained under lock and key. Now when they were first issued, pensions that is, those people that had taken the anti-treaty side and didn't recognise the validity of the Free State, something I still personally have some difficulties with, but leaving that aside, didn't make applications for obvious reasons. You can't not recognise a state and then claim a pension. So when Fianna Fáil came to power in 1932, lo and behold, they introduced a second Pensions Act, and a lot of fellas that hadn't previously applied. They've now all been released and they're online. You just go into the Military Service Pensions Archive and you can search by organisation, Irish Citizens Army, Irish Volunteers, mBan. You can search by name and so on. And what that has done, because they had to be verified, and by the way, quite a lot of pension applications were rejected, it's given us this phenomenal view of the Irish Revolution from the perspective of people at the lowest possible level. So we're no longer talking about Connolly and Pearce, MacDonagh and McBride, we're talking about a whole range of people. And what Stevie and others have done by trawling through the information is to discover for the first time, I think people in Ireland were genuinely quite shocked, the broad public were shocked, to discover the number of people that actually travelled from outside of Ireland, in many cases not of Irish birth but of descent, particularly from the west of Scotland, to participate in the Rising or to support the Rising, or indeed the subsequent War of Independence. And in Stevie's article, which is primarily initially about the Glasgow elements in 1916, you can see that some of those names, like Joe Robinson, etc., go on to become significant figures, both in the War of Independence and subsequently within the Free State and so on. So that's all very new. And that has allowed us to look at women, more so than ever before. Many women claim pensions, most famously people like Hackett and Winnie Carney and so on. And also to look at young people, because some of the people at the time that they first participated were, by our standards, children. You know, they were 14, 15, 16 and so on. They're both online, and they're certainly something, if you have relations either from Scotland or Irish relations, you can go into those sources and check out and get your family history. Just print off whatever you like. Okay? This is all part of what we call the decade of centenaries, which started in 2012 and will conclude in 2022. So we're looking at the period from the landing of the weapons in Larne and the creation of the Ulster Volunteer Force, through all of the events to the creation of the Free State and Northern Ireland. There's an equivalent body, believe it or not, in Northern Ireland, although it's not quite maybe as involved as in the Republic, but it has done good work and inclusive. So we've celebrated the Somme, the Ulster Division, the creation of the UBF, the Ulster Covenant and so on, just as much as we have commemorated the participation of people in the north of Ireland in things like the Rising. And the President has been involved in some of that activity in the north of Ireland. We've also attempted, not always successfully, to have east-west as well as north-south. And I think we should point out that the work done by Steve and Maggie and all of you here in the Heritage in Glasgow. I'm a member of a thing called the Expert Advisory Group to Government on the Decade of Centenaries, and I circulate your material that Steve gives me to all the members of that committee. So it is known and appreciated at the highest level within government policy. But the Decade of Centenaries, obviously, the pinnacle was 1916. Now, what's been remarkable for me about the events of this year and I think, by the way, this year we're all 1916 out, so there's a lot of fatigue has entered, has been the sheer scale and imagination of the events that have taken place across the island. You know, tapestries. I passed a Protestant national school in Donegal a few weeks ago, and they had built the GPO on the front of the school. Absolutely stunning, just outside Letterkenny. What do you call it? Artworks, plays, reenactments, sometimes really wonderful reenactments because they've remade uniforms and stuff. The involvement of school children in essay competitions. It was an All-Ireland essay competition. And on the day itself, that is to say the main state occasion, which followed Easter Sunday, which was a very moving day, which was done by the state and the military and so on Easter Monday, I think they estimate over 500,000 people came into Dublin. Now, there were events across the rest of the country. But what was extraordinary about that date was the sheer range of events. I think there were something like nearly 1,500 events, from art to drama to lectures to exhibitions, etc., across the city. There was no drunkenness. Well, maybe the odd one, but I mean, essentially it was a sober day. It wasn't like Patrick's Day. There was a huge sense of historic occasion and pride, but there was an absence of triumphalism, or even, if you like, rampant nationalism. There was an inclusive element to the day. It was really quite an extraordinary day. I'm living in Dublin since 1973, and I don't think I've ever experienced an atmosphere in the city quite like we had on that day. There was a great sense of occasion and nation and so on. Maybe what hasn't happened in 2016, which happened in 1966, which is often said that, you know, without 1966, would there have been 1969 and the beginnings of civil rights, etc.? There was certainly, in broad terms, a social connection. Now, it leads into other things, civil rights movement in the States, emergence of black Africa and so on. But nevertheless, the 66, none of that has happened. And some of the fears that the unionist population, for example, in the north of Ireland had about 1916, 2016, probably haven't manifested themselves. And that's in the shadow, shall we say, of the Good Friday Agreement and the rapprochement that is taking place. So some of the things that the state itself feared about the 1916 celebrations, and certainly the unionist community feared in the north, hasn't happened. And I would actually say, but almost the reverse has happened. I think in the north of Ireland, there is a broader understanding of what took place in 1916, the historical context, and if you like, the validity for people in the north of Ireland to identify with and celebrate that event. That's been my experience, and certainly that's been one of the positive aspects. I think at the last count there was something like 2,000 publications on 1916 in all sorts of guises. Every county council in the Republic, and I think one or two in the north of Ireland, have produced things ranging from small brochures linked to exhibitions to full-scale collections of essays. And again, that has meant we've had a look at 1916 literally across the country. Now, that's rather peculiar when you think that in 1916 the only activity was in Dublin, Ashbourne, a little bit in Coal Island, in Tyrone, and down in, there was a shooting in the glen of, what is it now, Tipperary. So the rising itself was, and something in Galway, was confined to Dublin because of the countermand by McNeill on the Easter Sunday, which cancelled the orders for rising for most of the volunteers. But nevertheless, activities did take place, and more importantly, there were people from most counties involved in the rising. And of course, we've taken the rising as, in cricketing terms, you know, the batsmen, the Irish, if you like, as batsmen, taking guard with what was to follow. So it's been quite phenomenal. Very hard for me to say, as somebody that was involved in producing Saothar, but I think Saothar stands alongside most of those publications. And the reason I think it does is because what we attempted to do was to try to examine and raise public consciousness about the degree to which 1916 involved the working class and working class ambition. Something that, broadly speaking, is missed from textbooks. I have read, well, I haven't read, but I've picked up every book on 1916 that I can find, and I always look at the index. And the number of them where I don't find Liberty Hall, ITGW in the index is bloody unbelievable. Bearing in mind the proclamation is printed there the officer commanding the forces was Connolly, etc. It is quite bewildering. So in trying to do that, we commissioned various pieces of work. Stevie contributed one, and then the fortune of me being here in March meant that we snared Chloe as well, to get two views of the Scottish dimension and the impact, in Chloe's case, the impact on the thinking of somebody like John Maclean, who prior to 1916 probably was not disposed to the Irish cause for all sorts of reasons, including reasons in terms of his own upbringing in the west of Scotland. We also commissioned an essay from two German scholars, Stefan Braun and Stefan Berger being one of the great names of European social history, to try to have a look at how the Rising was perceived outside of Ireland. And what they eventually did, which is narrower than perhaps we initially wanted, but timeframes are timeframes, they examined the German language socialist press reaction to the Rising. So they looked at German language newspapers for things like the Socialist Party and parties to the left. But they also looked at North American German language papers, which we now forget there were strong ethnic socialist movements in America. And by contrast, they looked then at English language papers in New Zealand and Australia. And just as a left field, they threw in Spain. What it seems to me is very interesting about that article, because in some ways it's pretty straightforward, is that reactions to the Rising, you could almost predict them. If the labour movements of the countries concerned were pro-war, they were anti-Rising. If they were anti-war, they were pro-Rising. And that, I think, is one of the key contexts of the 1916 Rising that incredibly significant historians in Ireland never refer to on occasion. Namely the war, the abandonment of the anti-imperialist position by the International, and the isolation of a thinker like Connolly. So that was point number one. Point number two is virtually all of the socialist press identified within the Rising the socialist ambition and element. Now, you might argue that maybe to some extent they would do that because they were socialist press, and there is an argument to say that to some extent they exaggerate the significance of that. But at the time, I don't think that actually was the case, and that brings us to Connolly. It's become very fashionable in the last number of years to begin to criticise Connolly, and the standard line is he abandoned the red and submerged himself to the green, and, as a consequence, the man sold out his life. This criticism almost always comes from people that are actually privately quite glad, if he did do that, that that's what he did, because they're certainly not people that would be socialist or identified with the socialist perspective. And you might still argue that in terms of why did Connolly ultimately do what he did. Now that also raises a second question, and that is, if Connolly hadn't done what he did, in other words, once McNeill had countered the order, and therefore effectively signalled the cancelling of the intended Rising, it seems to me from anything I've read that the two individuals in the main that insisted that they would go ahead were Thomas Clarke, for reasons that perhaps were quite unique to Thomas Clarke, and Connolly. And Connolly, of course, with the commitment of the Citizen Army. And the Citizen Army turned out, I think it was 90-odd% of the Citizen Army enrolled members actually fought, as opposed to significantly lower numbers in the volunteers, although more volunteers fought in the Citizen Army. And there are two things ascribed to Connolly, and they're only ascribed to Connolly by William O'Brien. Now, William O'Brien did not fight in the Rising, partly because, and mainly because, he was famous for a club foot, he was semi-disabled, and therefore was engaged in drilling and so on. And he becomes the most significant figure after the Rising in terms of the labour movement, not to be discussed today, but he was. But anyway, he's at the doors of Liberty Hall when the boys leave. And he claims that Connolly said two things to him. The first was that we're going out to be slaughtered. And that has often been interpreted as the blood sacrifice of Pearse, which is why the whole thing was wrong and so on. I don't think if Connolly said such a thing, and I have no particular reason to believe that he didn't, that's quite what he meant. I think what people forget about Connolly, until you start to read what he did during the Rising, is that he was gifted as a militarist. He understood precisely what the forces of the battle would be. And on any logical position, if you take what was happening, they were never going to win the battle. They had an ambition to hold out for a number of days and so on. So I think it was more in that case. There's another view that Connolly had, which comes across when you read him widely. He did have a bit of a sense of black humour, so it might have even just been a wee bit like that. But the second thing, which I think is almost more important, is what he said that he had said to his troops of the citizen army before the citizen army was abandoned into Óglaigh na hÉireann, the Irish Republican Army, when the individual elements merged to become the forces of 1916. And that was to advise them that in the unlikely event that they did win, they were to hold on to their rifles. And the reason they were to hold on to their rifles is because the enemy would not have changed. It might have changed in terms of the flag it owed allegiance to. In class terms, it wouldn't change. And maybe the tragedy, the biggest tragedy of 1916, which that international press that I referred to picked up on, was the biggest victim of 1916 was the loss of the leader intellectually and in terms of moral strength of the socialist movement in Ireland, and more broadly, Connolly. And that leads to the next point, which is Connolly's loss was perceived in the international press, and we're now going beyond the German language press, as a thinker of significance on a global scale. And I think in Britain, never mind Scotland, his country of birth, it is interesting to me that socialist theorists from the UK, etc., almost never refer to Connolly or his texts, even though they're very illustrative in terms of things like guerrilla warfare and insurrection, in terms of trade union organisation, syndicalist values, the nature of the trade union movement and so on. So Connolly's loss is perceived as being a massive blow. The next thing we did was we tried to have a look at how the Rising was perceived in other sort of locations. So there's, I think, a pretty good essay by Bruce Nelson, well-known Black American historian, as to how the Irish Rising was perceived in Black America. So we're looking at Marcus Garvey and people like that, Hubert Harrison. And again, I think what's very interesting is the Irish, for the Black Americans, were often seen, as they were, and still are in places like South Boston, not distinguished by their tolerance of black people or their non-racism. And again, it begins to change. So that essay, I think, is actually quite an interesting essay to look at. The next essay was by Kate O'Malley, who I think was over here recently with this society, talking about Indian reactions. And again, we forget now that when you looked at the socialist press, including the Scottish socialist press, at the period of 1916, all the way through maybe to Indian independence in 1947, was that India and Ireland were often on the same page. They were seen as bookends of a similar struggle against the imperialist central power. And there's a quotation in Kate's essay from Nehru's widow, or Nehru's wife, who staggeringly to me said something along the lines of, and I'm quoting indirectly, "Easter week was the most exciting week of my life and remains so." And you think, Jesus, she lived through Indian independence. But what she meant, of course, was the inspiration. And that's the next point that we need to dwell on, particularly Scots in a still repressed nation. The significance of the Easter Rising in terms of global opposition to the major, apparently immutable empires, be they the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the British Empire, is not to be underestimated. And one of the criticisms I would make of Ireland as an independent nation, partly independent nation, is that we have never lived that role subsequently to give leadership to non-aligned groups or to neutral groups and so on. And there's a book about to be published by Jack's Press on Ireland and the Russian Revolution and subsequent Irish-Russian relations. And what comes across from that very clearly, almost from the beginning, is how the Irish Free State continues subjected itself privately to British imperial designs and pressures, all the way through in terms of the attitude to Ireland, including, for example, not allowing Russian diplomats when they came to Ireland to cross the border, things like that. So it seems to me that that's one of the lessons about 1916 that is something we still don't speak about. What have we done? What did we do with this beacon light that we showed for people in small nations, and what do we continue to do? The last thing that we tried to do was to show, as I've said, the working class content. And I think one of the failures of the journal, because we just didn't get the work, was to examine the class structure, not just of the citizen army, which is fairly self-evident. One of the rules of the citizen army, for example, is you had to be a trade union member. But to look at the class structure of the volunteers themselves. And there are hints of that in the journal, but we didn't manage to commission or get an article, although the article on the women's groups by Eve Morrison sort of touches on that. The thing about the volunteers was two things, I suppose. First of all, there tended to be a division in the volunteers, bearing in mind that they were often spontaneous groups that attended a public meeting and afterwards became volunteers. And it reminds me of Dad's Army. The equivalents of Mannering automatically assumed the officer positions and so on. So you tend to get a class division, the officer groups in the volunteers, were either the larger farmers as opposed to the labourers, you know, or the grocers or whatever. So there's a class element of the volunteers. And I don't think that's really ever been looked at very much. And in particular, how those class issues manifested themselves through the War of Independence and then subsequently into the Civil War. Now, I don't know enough about this myself, but I suspect that you'd find a fairly strong class division if you looked at how the volunteers broke after the treaty between working class people tended to be anti-treaty and so on. So that was one of the things that we didn't manage to do. But what we did manage to do, I think, is to reclaim 1916 for the Citizens' Army, for the Transport Union, for Connolly and so on, in a way that others have done it for women. And I think to that extent it was a fine production. Just two final things in conclusion. The first is that I've been involved with Saothar before, but there was a sort of, very hard to verbalise really, but a sort of a sense of occasion almost from the beginning. So for example, in talking to Steve, and in particular talking to Chloe, who we met here, what, March was it when we met? And I discovered she'd written this piece. And her speed with which she returned the copy, the willingness with which she made whatever alterations or corrections we felt, usually in her case simply style for the journal and stuff, was fantastic. And I think Chloe turned that thing around in about 6 weeks. Because bearing in mind I met you in March. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, but it was done quickly, and she wasn't the only one. A lot of people, if you like, fell on their swords to produce material, and I think that was one of the great things about the journal. And I think they did that, not necessarily Chloe, well, I can't speak for Chloe or Steve, but I think people did that not just as historians, but as, you know, as being part of the project, shall we say, that the thing was perceived as being in 1916. The last thing for me to say in relation to Saothar 41 is that I think it will be a collector's item. And already there's an indication that it is in huge demand. I think it's a beautiful production which has got nothing to do with me. We have to acknowledge the work of a man called Christy Hammond, who works for CRM Design and Print. Christy is a member of SIPTU print group, and when his company closed some years ago and they were made redundant at a week's notice, in some cases after 40 odd years, he decided, 3 of them, to put their redundancy money into setting up on their own. The company they were with wouldn't allow them to buy the material, the machines or the stock, so they had to start from scratch. So there's a sort of socialist dimension as to why we use Christy, and he's now become a significant printer for the trade union movement. But he does the design. And I think the design of the cover and elsewhere is pretty good, and Christy just throws that in. We don't get charged for design or making plates, so Christy Hammond deserves some credit for that. So I think, as I say, it will be a collector's item. And the last of all comments is, we're making history here tonight as well. I don't know of any other Irish history journal that has ever been launched somewhere other than Ireland, with the exception of Era Ireland, which is an Irish-American journal, so it gets launched simultaneously on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think we owe a debt to Steve, to Maggie, and to all of you involved in the Heritage Council for allowing us to come tonight, and therefore giving us the opportunity also to finally put Fearon up in Glasgow. So we are deeply grateful, and I think it's very hard to express how grateful we feel. And as Jack has touched on various things, maybe we should just conclude by saying it is significant not only that, as Steve and Chloe have shown, that there was a strong Scottish dimension to 1916, but I think we should take mutual satisfaction that one of the great figures of 20th century socialism was a Scot, albeit one who finished up in Ireland. And in that respect, that's my heritage, and I'm proud of it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Francie, for that. Your usual inspirational self. I'm just going to give an indication of what we'll do. We're going to have some remarks from Stevie, And then we're going to be making our way to the first floor where the plaque is, and that's going to be unveiled by our Secretary of the Trades Council, Jennifer, who will be very happy for her to do it. And then at 9 o'clock, or after the unveiling, we'll come downstairs to prepare for the next session I'm going to have, which is the story of the Easter Rising, which will be done by James and Finlay through music and a visual account of the rising. So it's...
I just want to say two quick things which I forgot to say. Jack talked about our premise as a beggar's bush. There was a microcosmic view of Irish society in that when the British Army detachment left Beggar's Bush, a friend of mine's two uncles, one of them marched out as a member of the British Army, and the other guy marched in as a member of the Free State Army. And a year later, the guy that marched in as a member of the Free State Army was firing on the man that marched out, who was in the forecourts with Roddy O'Connor on the anti-treaty side in the Civil War. And I think that in itself. And the final thing I should have acknowledged my great pal, Jim Friel, who's been a constant supporter of the movement in Ireland from his position in the print unions and in the STUC. And I stayed with Jimmy once. He lives in Baillieston, and Jimmy had not been too well. And I got up in the morning and I said to Jimmy, I'm knitting down the Cork to buy a few things for breakfast. And Jimmy says to me, forgive my attempt at a Glasgow accent, see, he says, when you get down the Cork, he says, did you buy my copy of the Morning Star? He basically said, you'll find it at the bottom. So what he did every day was he took the other copy of the Star and put it on the top. And see all that Tory shite, he says, I've done that out. Make sure you do that. So I got into the Baillieston Cork about 5 to 9, just before they opened, found the wee bits and pieces, and I go up to the till, and there's a wee lassie there, and she's no open for 2 minutes, you know, so that was fine. And then eventually she scanned the items with complete disinterest and gave me the price. I put the money down, put the wee things in the bag, and she took the change. And as I'm walking away, she says, "Attacking Comrade Friel has sent you."